Shabbat Shalom. Good morning. I've been struggling with this week's double parsha, Bahar Behukotai, since I was 13 years old, which was the first time I wrote a Devar Torah for this parsha, for my own bar mitzvah. It was 2009 in Lexington, Massachusetts, and I was wrestling for the first time with what it means for God to reward us for following mitzvot and punish us for failing to follow mitzvot. Behukotai begins with a list of blessings that the Israelites would enjoy if they follow God's commandments. And the blessings are beautiful. They'll have abundant harvests, peace in the land, and the presence of God dwelling in their midst. And then it continues with a much more specific and quite terrifying list of horrific punishments that would befall them if they failed to follow the commandments. Plague and famine and violence, a permanent feeling of being chased, a world that no longer functions as it should. And I remember sitting on the floor in the basement of our house with my grandfather, who's a rabbi, with sources laid out in front of us, scratching my head and trying to make some sense of the most challenging ideas I had ever encountered. Because this theology is problematic, to say the least. It's impossible to find this one-for-one, tit-for-tat system of reward and punishment at work in our world. What about good people who suffer? And what about bad people who reap the rewards of their crimes? These questions have been asked since the moment that bad things started happening to good people. And from that point on, our tradition has sought a satisfying answer. And there are lots of traditional answers to this theological paradox, some of which focus on the idea that individuals are not punished for their own deeds or misdeeds in this world, but that collectively, our society enjoys the blessings or suffers the consequences of the world that we are building together. This perspective says we shouldn't expect direct reward and punishment for our good deeds or our bad actions. Rather, our deeds and the deeds of other people are mixed up, and as a community, we reap blessings or curses. It's a theology that says we have not yet built a world of justice and peace, and we collectively have more to do. Sometimes I find a lot of wisdom and encouragement in this approach, and the others in our tradition that have turned to explain violence and pain in our world. They offer us a role to play in the creation of a better world. But at other times, I can't stand to listen to our tradition's attempts to make sense of senselessness. Any theology that attempts to make sense of why bad things happen to good people feels particularly challenging this week. We woke up on Thursday morning to the horrific news from Washington, D.C. about the murder of Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Milgram, two Israeli embassy staff members who were shot outside of a gathering of the American Jewish Committee for their annual Young Diplomats reception. They were killed simply for breathing in public as people affiliated with the Jewish state. This attack is the manifestation of our fears for American Jewish safety. Fears that many of us have felt with much greater urgency in the past few years. Violence against Jews in the land of the free has once again rattled us to our cores. Yaron and Sarah were two young people eager to find their role in the pursuit of peace for Israel and its neighbors. They were about to become engaged next week in Jerusalem. And so as we sit here in the fog of fear and heartbreak and senselessness that this violence has created for us, it is really hard to read a parsha with a theology that, at least on its surface, seems to reward the good and punish the bad. This week I found myself drawn to the wisdom of Dr. Tamar Kamiankowski, who's a Bible scholar at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, who insists in her work that any attempt to make sense of violence in the Bible cannot help but become part of a system of violence. I don't want to have to make sense of violence in our world for Parshat Behukotai to be meaningful. I don't want to have to make the incoherent somehow coherent, because in a week like this, the very fact that we can't always draw straight lines between our actions and what happens to us feels like the greatest curse of all. And so maybe it's time to start telling a different story about what there is to learn from this parsha's list of blessings and curses. Maybe it's time to stop looking for a paradigm that will explain them and start looking for a paradigm that will help us live well in a world where the distribution of blessings and curses too often feels random. There are 7 cycles of curses, this long extended rebuke that takes up a lot of the middle of Behukotai. It's known as the Tochacha, the rebuke. And each cycle is more gruesome than the next. And then in the beginning of the 6th cycle, we read the following. As for those of you who survive the previous round of curses, I will cast a faintness into their hearts in the land of their enemies. The sound of a driven leaf shall put them to flight. Fleeing as though from the sword they shall fall, though none pursues. This curse is less physically violent than some of the previous curses, but I find it to be no less terrifying, because the Israelites are warned that their hearts will grow so faint from experiencing all of the curses before and the curses yet to come, so weary and so fragile, that the sound of a leaf falling off a tree will send them into a state of panic. This is the curse of being frazzled, of being at your wit's end, of being so overwhelmed by the unfolding disasters around you that you would jump and run at the most subtle of movements. The Kli Yakar, the 17th century rabbi of the Prague Jewish community, picks up on this curse and transforms it into what I think can be a profound teaching for us as we make our way through what feels like this era of curses. In his comment, he first refers to a pasuk slightly earlier in the curse, where God promises to scatter the Israelites among the nations. And he says that failing to commit to the system of mitzvot will cause the Israelites to not only become scattered among the nations, but scattered from each other. This is what he writes, quote, Israel will become scattered like when a person winnows barley, and not one of the barley grains clings to the next. So too the people of Israel become detached from one another, even while in the land of their enemies. Although exiles usually console one another, the people of Israel would not be that way, for they are scattered and separated from each other even when they are in exile. Each one is pushed by the wind and pushes others into the wind. End quote. That's the Kli Yakar. This image is striking. Barley grains that were all once connected to one stem are becoming detached, and they're suddenly floating off through the air away from each other. Even in exile, where one would think that the Israelites' instinct would be to turn toward one another, we learn that in this curse they will end up turning away from each other, too exhausted and frightened to find each other, unable to cling to each other as each Israelite floats away in the breeze. According to the Kli Yakar, the essence of this curse is that if the Israelites don't take advantage of the system of mitzvot that was designed to keep them bound to each other, then the Israelites themselves become driven leaves. While we in this room might not have the same theology or the same understanding of commandedness as the Kli Yakar, we know that feeling of alienation and loneliness when things get dark and overwhelming. Speaking personally, my instinct when unexpected tragedy happens is sometimes to isolate myself, to box up the fear and the pain of living in a state of unpredictability. When I first heard about Yaron and Sarah, my second instinct was to reach out and call the people I knew who probably knew them. But my first instinct was to dive under the covers and turn off the light. Sometimes our first instinct when we feel the curse is coming is to put up our walls and enter into self-protection mode. And this is a natural reaction to living in a world of curses, but the Kli Yakar points out what can happen if we let that spiritual posture take hold as a baseline for the long run. If we don't push against the entropy that naturally sends us drifting away from each other when we're overwhelmed by the curses of our world, we become driven leaves, flying solo in the air. We become the curse. The Kli Yakar seems to be challenging us to find some way, as the driven leaves that we are, fluttering around in a world that doesn't make sense, to steer into the wind, to steer back towards each other, and to steer toward the structure of community that binds us together. Rabbi Art Green points out a notable phrase toward the end of our parsha that I think offers some insight into what the Kli Yakar was hoping that we would get from his commentary. Rabbi Green quotes chapter 26, verse 46, where the text refers again to the laws that God established for the Israelites. And we read there that God established the mitzvot, Beino uven bnei Yisrael bahar Sinai beyad Moshe. God established the mitzvot with Moshe on Mount Sinai with the Israelite people. Beino uven bnei Yisrael, between Moshe and the people of Israel, which probably sounds familiar, Beini uven bnei Yisrael from Vishamru. And Rabbi Green uses that parallel to Vishamru to teach that at Mount Sinai, God placed the mitzvot between the Israelites, Beini uven bnei Yisrael, in between each Israelite and their fellow, as a way to tether themselves to each other. And I love that image, because in so many ways, the purpose of mitzvot is to connect us to each other. Judaism is not a solo religion. At its core, it's a communal religion, making a minyan when someone's saying Kaddish, visiting the sick, studying Torah together, coming together to pray on Shabbat morning. All of these are designed to encourage us, to command us, to show up in community, no matter what is going on in the world, even and especially when our instinct might be to head for the hills. Our tradition trains our souls to resist alienation. It demands over and over again that we show up for each other. It recognizes that we desperately need each other if we're going to live well in this world. And so the mitzvot are placed between us with the hope that we will hold on to them and they will hold on to us, and they will help us hold on to each other as the winds of uncertainty and fear swirl around. Behukotai actually opens with an image of how to live this out, and it's an image that counters the chaos and isolation of the Kli Yakar's warning. It opens with the words, Im bechukotai telechu, if you follow my laws and commandments. And the word telechu literally means walking, in the plural. If you all walk together, the text tells us, blessing will come. In a world where we feel bandied about like driven leaves in the wind, where Behukotai's promise of justice more often than not feels like a cruel taunt, our tradition's radical request is that we walk alongside each other and build our lives in community together. It asks that we respond to the terror of the world by moving towards one another and by moving towards a tradition that constantly invites us to move towards one another. It asks us to recognize that perhaps this is the way that we can transform ourselves into the blessings that we so desperately need. Shabbat Shalom.